Northern Rwanda, July 4th, 2015. In July 1994, troops of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or INKOTANYI, seized the capital Kigali and put an end to the mass slaughter of the Tutsi population. It was the final genocide of the 20th century. The Rwandan Patriotic Front is a political and military movement founded in 1987. Paul Kagame has led the RPF since the early 1990s and has been Rwanda's president since 2003.
In our culture, we make a distinction between what is good and what is evil. No one needs to explain that to us. We don't need anyone to show us the path to dignity. We know what to do. We fought for that. Our people were killed for that. No one has the right to condemn us.
Over just 100 days between April and July 1994, one of history's most notorious killing machines tore through Rwanda. 1 million Tutsis were exterminated, often with the active support of the local population. Paul Kagame and the INKOTANYI are at the heart of this complex story of unparalleled violence. That story deserves to be told in full through interviews with some of the major participants.
In history, the different kings and kingdoms had armies. There is no trace anywhere where Rwandans killed other Rwandans like this. This whole thing about Hutu, Tutsi, and they were all part of the army that the king had. And actually many Hutus, commanders and others, chiefs. And so INKOTANYI was one of the armies that existed then.
Our story begins in the 1950s. At that time, Rwanda was still governed by Belgium. Rwanda is one of the smallest countries in Africa and is the most densely populated. It's sometimes called the land of 1,000 hills. The country's main crops are tea and coffee. 3 population groups share the same land, language, and gods. The majority Hutu, who are farmers, the Tutsi, who raise cattle, and the Twa, who are hunter-gatherers. Belgium decided that all 3 were ethnic groups and threw its support behind the Tutsi. But with the rise of the African independence movement in the 1950s, the Tutsi demanded an end to Belgium's rule. The Belgians, supported by the Vatican and the White Fathers group of Catholic missionaries, responded by building up the political and social strength of the Hutu. This was to have immediate and tragic consequences. In 1959, the Hutu launched a violent wave of attacks on the Tutsi minority, calling it a social revolution. After Rwanda gained its independence in 1962, Gregoire Kayibanda, a young Hutu, was sworn in as president. An estimated 20,000 Tutsis had been killed in the conflict, and 150,000 others fled to neighboring countries.
Some went to Burundi, others to Congo, Uganda, Tanzania. So my family went to Uganda. That's where we stayed for a couple of decades as refugees. So we grew up in a refugee camp. We had camps shifting from one place to another in Uganda.
When I went to refugee camp, there had been militants fighting the government of Rwanda, older than me, and we used to hear their stories. We thought they were heroes. They attacked Rwanda a couple of times from Congo side, from the Uganda side, from Burundi side, from Tanzania. Those stories of what they used to call Inyenzi, fighters.
Ces terroristes se trouvent à l'extérieur du pays.
These terrorists are based outside the country. 10, 20, or 40 of them cross the border at night. But I believe it will be absolutely impossible for them to overthrow the regime.
Are you Tutsi?
Yes.
What will happen now?
To me, I'll be put in prison or killed.
Aren't you afraid?
Everyone dies.
And then they lost steam, they lost energy, they had internal fighting most of the time, so they couldn't really formulate even a common cause to fight for.
What do you think of the Tutsi terrorists?
It's just a few hotheads. They recruit young people. Most of them are bandits.
Gregoire Kayibanda was president for 10 years. During that time, those Tutsi who remained in Rwanda suffered widespread repression. Many were deported to the Bugesera swamps. In 1973, Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu from the country's north, overthrew Kayibanda's regime. The massacres of Tutsis came to an end, but they were still subjected to discrimination. The Tutsis regrouped in neighboring countries, particularly in Uganda, where many Rwandans lived in exile. At first, their struggle was cultural, and then expanded to include a political and military agenda. In the early 1980s, the Tutsi exiles won support from the leader of Uganda's national resistance movement, Yoweri Museveni.
The national resistance movement is a nationalist organization. It is a nationalist in the sense that it is fighting for the aims of the whole country and not for aims of a section of the country.
They just come by themselves, yes, because we are recruiting, open recruitment. They just, because also it is not easy to know who is Rwandese and who is Uganda, because they are the same people. Yes, if the youth are running to join the army, you can't know this one is Rwandese. They were part of the Tutsi diaspora.
Rwandan Tutsis made up 1/3 of these forces. One of the top commanders was Fred Ruigema. Another was Paul Kagame, who specialized in intelligence operations. When Museveni was sworn in as Uganda's president in 1986, he appointed both men to senior posts. Ruigema became Deputy Minister of Defense, and Kagame took over as head of intelligence. Did Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana suspect that during this parade he was watching those who would bring down his government just a few years later?
In '86, most of us had already been part of the armed struggle in Uganda and had acquired these skills. We learned a lot. We were growing and maturing ideologically and politically. So we tried to bring everybody together. In fact, that's why the name, the Rwandese Patriotic Front.
The Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, was created in 1987. It was supported by Tutsi exiles and some Hutu government opponents, like future RPF chairman Alexis Kanyarengwe. The organization built up a military force led by Fred Ruigema. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in Uganda. The military and at least part of the civilian population became increasingly upset about the presence of large numbers of Rwandan Tutsis.
Well, though they've been, given hospitality for the last 30 years, Rwandese in Uganda have been treated as, they came over as workers and, they've always been looked down on. So they've been disgruntled people. So that's why they should really go.
President Museveni responded to the discontent by ordering a census of Tutsi exiles in Uganda. Deputy Defense Minister Fred Ruigema saw this as a threat to the Tutsis and decided it was time for them to return home.
I kept telling Ruigema, please, we have fought here in Uganda and won. But we fought because we had support of the population. Rwanda continued to do political work. I will support you because I don't want you to be defeated and come back here.
There was this mood within the Rwandans within the NRA that we would definitely attack Rwanda. It was so quickly decided. We moved as Ugandan soldiers, uniforms, guns, everything, up to the border. It's only when we crossed the border that we removed only the military pips, the military ranks, but stayed with the uniform. Striking the border on the 1st of October was very easy. Habyarimana's forces fled. And in the morning before we left Kagitumba, we were only surprised to see the enemy start to share us with his artillery. The leader, Major General Fred Ruigema, he took the lead. And just minutes after, as he was standing on an exposed hill, open, in front of the enemy directly, the enemy shot random bullets, and he was shot on the forehead, and that was the end.
That's the official version. But other reports say he was killed by a deputy commander in an argument over military tactics. For the time being, Ruigema's death was kept secret, so as not to demoralize the troops or to encourage the enemy.
We knew that some of the soldiers had fought for the liberation of Uganda. We knew that they had experience in conventional warfare and guerrilla tactics. On October 1st, 1990, when we got the order to attack, my comrades who were my age were afraid because we had no experience in battle.
The troops who attacked us then mixed with the civilian population. Enemy forces attacked the capital. So the next day, we decided to stage a raid in the area around Kigali.
In the Rwandan capital, 10,000 Tutsis were detained. President Habyarimana appealed for help from friendly states like Zaire, and especially France. Ties between Kigali and Paris had been close since the 1980s. President François Mitterrand felt he had to support France's main ally in East Africa.
I was in Jean-Christophe Mitterrand's office on October 5th. The phone rang, and I knew right away that Habyarimana was on the line. They talked for 4 or 5 minutes. Mitterrand hung up and said, "Well, here we go. They've gone berserk in Kigali. The rebels have reached the capital." That wasn't true, but that's what Habyarimana had told him. Mitterrand seemed to believe it, though. He said, "We'll send the guys some troops, and it'll all be over in 3 months." That assessment was a bit premature.
The force nearly was completely destroyed. So we had to change the way then. We went back to guerrilla and mobile warfare that enables you to cause damage but also survive.
In 1990, Kagame had been studying at a military college in the U.S., but returned to Rwanda to lead the RPF troops. His new strategy was to move his forces out of open areas where they were exposed to enemy attack and deploy them in the mountains.
I was helped by this very bad lesson we had learned. I was saying, but look at where we are. We are here because of indiscipline. So we said, make a choice. It's simple to be disciplined and do things the right way and the right time, or you perish. I don't think any one of us should be making the choice to perish. And we started accounting for everything, starting with our lives, because so many people were killed because of some indiscipline.
As Kagame deployed the RPF for operations, he at the same time deployed Habyarimana's forces, because the Habyarimana forces lost initiative and only responded to his movements. The French came to his side and supported in all ways. I personally heard the French complain, yeah, because I don't remember very well in the French, but what I heard, because we were monitoring the French and the XFR, I heard them saying the FAR are très faible. You know, they were like abusing them.
Of course, the France, meaning the government, when I talk about France, I don't mean the people. No, I don't mean the people. I mean the government and the institutions that represent them. It's not the people. They were on the side of Habyarimana, on the side of government. They used their own weapons, 105 millimeter mortars, 120 millimeter mortars.
The INKOTANYI suffered heavy casualties in the fighting. Throughout 1992, there was a succession of battles and ceasefires. The rebels seized towns that had been abandoned by terrified residents. Paul Kagame's troops set up their headquarters at a tea factory in the village of Mulindi, which stands over the hills of northern Rwanda. The INKOTANYI continued to advance. At the same time, government troops carried out a number of deadly attacks on Tutsi civilians. The soldiers referred to them derisively as inyenzi, or cockroaches.
The Inyenzi have returned. They've sent their own children to fight here. All of you know that. Let us exterminate these cockroaches. Remember what is written in the Gospel. If you give the snake a chance to bite, it will bite. We must drive all of them out to Ethiopia.
February 8, 1993, a date that could have changed the course of history. In response to the first massacre, the INKOTANYI launched a major attack that took them all the way to Kigali. President Habyarimana was forced to negotiate.
And the regional leaders, they said, no, you have to stop and negotiate. The French said, you must stop and negotiate. The Americans said, you must negotiate. The Belgians said, you must negotiate. So we said, okay.
Kagame decided against securing a quick military victory against the government. But he had definitely proven to the international community that his forces held the upper hand. Peace talks began in the Tanzanian city of Arusha. None of the sides involved in the conflict seemed interested in an agreement. President Habyarimana had little room to negotiate. The Defense Ministry's Chief of Staff, Colonel Theoneste Bagasora, refused to hold talks with the RPF. And a powerful group of Hutu extremists, led by the president's wife, worked hard to keep the Tutsis from having a share of political power.
We came here to negotiate the final details of how to put the government of transition in place. Christophe Bagosora didn't want anything to change, anything. What happened was an aggression by foreigners, that's what they called us. And that had to be stopped militarily, but he could. So they went to negotiations because they are losing the war. That's all. So when he stormed out of the negotiation in Arusha, that's when he told us he's going to carry out apocalypse.
The INKOTANYI scored an impressive diplomatic victory. They were assigned fully 1/2 of the officers in Rwanda's new army and 40% of the rest of the troops. And they managed to secure a total of 4 ministries in the future National Unity Government. "600 INKOTANYI soldiers were sent to the new parliament in Kigali to protect the Tutsi politicians. Paul Kagame remained at his headquarters in Mulindi. Thousands of people gathered along the road between Mulindi and Kigali to cheer the INKOTANYI troops. 4 months later, most of them would be dead.
The plan was to set up a transitional government. But Habyarimana kept putting it off because he didn't want it.
President Habyarimana was now isolated. His political options were limited. In early 1994, this situation created a power vacuum that was soon filled by Hutu extremists. The Akazu group, led by the president's wife and some senior military officers, now stepped up their campaign against the Tutsis. The president's paramilitary militias, known as the Interamwe, joined the campaign. Colonel Bogosora bought 500,000 machetes from China and handed them out to the Hutus. And the state propaganda machine went into high gear. The extremist Hutu newspaper Kangura, and especially the radio station Mille Collines, stirred up anti-Tutsi sentiment.
They are evil. God must help us to exterminate them. The INKOTANYI are an evil group. The only solution is to exterminate them.
We listened to that radio station, Mille Collines. And at first we laughed, because we couldn't believe what they were saying. But their broadcasts were done well, and they were convincing. So you had to respect them for that. They were real professionals and knew how to send the right messages. But it wasn't until the genocide really started that we realized the role that this radio station was playing.
South of Kigali, in the swamplands of Bugesera, the Interamwe massacred entire families of Tutsis. It was the opening round of a campaign of ethnic cleansing that would soon haunt the region.
These massacres gradually destroyed the trust that had slowly been established between the Rwandan people and the Rwandan Patriotic Front.
Every morning, the Interahamwe drove past us in pickup trucks. We were in the building that housed the National Development Council, today's parliament. They drove through the streets and screamed, "We will kill you! We will kill you!"
In April 1994, President Habyarimana flew to Tanzania to ratify peace treaties that would exclude Hutu extremists from government.
We left after the founder Habyarimana and the president of Burundi in the airport, Dar es Salaam. They took off before me. It was already like 7, and it was getting dark. So I said, why should the president travel at night in this type of situation?
The Minister of Defense regrets to inform you that the Rwandan head of state has died unexpectedly. His Excellency, Major General Juvenal Habyarimana, was killed on April 6, 1994, at approximately 8:30 p.m. The aircraft in which he was returning from Dar es Salaam was shot down in circumstances that are still not clear.
Who had shot down Habyarimana's plane? There were several suspects, including the radical Hutus in the Akazu group. They had an interest in removing a weak leader who had just sabotaged their political power. And Paul Kagame, who saw the president as an enemy who would likely never implement the terms of the peace treaty. In April 1994, Rwanda descended into political chaos. But the government responded remarkably quickly to Habyarimana's death. Within minutes of the announcement, the Presidential Guard set up barriers and checkpoints throughout the capital.
They cordoned off everything and took control everywhere. We, the police, no longer had access to important parts of the city. The UN peacekeeping troops couldn't get through either. We had the legal right to go where we needed to, but the presidential guards had everything locked down. Soldiers had set up anti-aircraft batteries. The investigation into the president's death claimed that the Belgians were responsible, or perhaps the INKOTANYI. But that didn't make any sense. No sense at all.
At RPF headquarters in Mulundi, James Kabarebe, a senior advisor to Paul Kagame, briefed his boss on the situation in the capital.
So we are there in the night watching football. Around that time, the message came from our people at the parliament. Actually, people had started fleeing already and coming to the parliament. It was so fast that as soon as Germana's plane was brought down, I don't think even 5 minutes passed, something was already happening.
The next morning, some moderate Hutus were murdered, including Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana. 10 Belgian soldiers who'd been assigned to protect her were killed.
The families of Belgian soldiers are in danger. They should stay home. The Presidential Guard has arrived at the airport and they want our units to put down their weapons. They're going to kill them.
The radical Hutus had sent a clear message to the United Nations. At the same time, men, women, and children of all ages, whose identity cards identified them as Tutsis, were tortured and killed at checkpoints.
Members of the Interahamwe and the Presidential Guard ran around killing everyone they could find. I stayed at the Presidential Palace to take care of people who had fled there. We and the soldiers provided them with food and treated the wounded. Many of them had cuts and other injuries. A lot of soldiers were also wounded. I called Bagosora and told him, if you continue like this, it will never stop. They cut the line, and that's the last we heard of them.
Bagosora had a lot of power. He was the chief of staff at the Defense Ministry and controlled the Hutu militias and the Presidential Guard. Some officers wanted Bagosora to take power. It almost seemed as though they'd been planning for this for a long time. But others were against it.
On April 8th, the Rwandan caretaker government was assembled at the French embassy. The new prime minister was Jean Kambanda, a banker and technocrat.
We will win the war against the INKOTANYI because with the support of the people, we outnumber them. And we will defeat them.
I knew immediately that our force was in danger and our leaders who were there were in danger. They would be attacked. And this was a limited force. So the immediate thing I thought of was to reinforce them. To reinforce them now wasn't going to follow any rules. I wasn't going to ask the UN to allow me to reinforce them because I knew this, what was happening was not following any rules.
The strategy of Kigali was mainly concentrated on rescue missions. To engage the ex-FAR in their military camps and confine them, that is stopping them from going out to kill people. At the same time, open corridors for survivors to evacuate.
The dead have been lying here for 3 days. Men, women, and a lot of children and young people.
The international community intervened to evacuate its citizens. This effort inadvertently led to one of the worst massacres in modern history. The Tutsi were left to try to defend themselves against Hutu attacks. There were scenes of unimaginable barbarity, and some of it was captured on video.
We knew that the people we left behind would be killed. We failed to help them. There were situations in which it would have been appropriate for us to ignore our orders. For example, we could have rescued the 5,000 people who were hiding at the technical school in Kikokiro. It wasn't far from the airport. We could have brought those people to a shelter there. But we didn't. We gave up and left.
I went to New York. That's where I went to plead Security Council to accept that the government of Rwanda is committing a genocide. That was difficult. At that time, Secretary General was Boutros Ghali. I would go and we meet, introduce the subject, and we would say, okay, you go and see Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan had nothing to say. I think the reports we're getting, things have got out of hand. And Security Council decided to put back the troops. Madeleine wrote about it. They had instructions from above not to use the term genocide. And she put in, I think, an excuse that they didn't want to use the term genocide, so the United States has to deploy forces.
We have to kill them day after day. We are very committed. We are doing everything here so that they cannot invade the city.
One day, I recorded a 90-minute phone conversation with the mayor of Kikumbi. He had asked the prefect for help because the INKOTANYI were approaching his village. He wanted the officials to evacuate the village. The prefect stayed calm and said, okay, we'll take care of it. And it went on like that. And at one point the mayor said, everything else here is fine. We're doing a good job. I think we've taken care of the Tutsi problem for the next 100 years.
We were overstretched, fighting the battles with the military and then fighting the militias and trying to stop the killings of civilians and saving as many as we could. It was an overstretch. It was, so to speak, we were like outnumbered 50 times.
The RPF INKOTANYI forces were not very large, and Belgium sent only 12,500 soldiers. There were killings everywhere. No army could have stopped it. It would have taken 300,000 men. I was at an RPF INKOTANYI military camp about 4 or 5 kilometers from here. The soldiers said they were going to take me to the site of a massacre. I remember what one of them said to me at the time. It really had an effect on me. He said, when I saw all those dead people, it felt like my brain was melting. I found that expression interesting. He just couldn't believe what he had seen. The first thing I saw, about 20 meters from the church, was the corpse of a child about 2 years old, and 2 or 3 other dead bodies. There was a statue of Christ at the church. They had used a machine gun to shoot his head off. I asked the soldier why, and he said, because that Christ looked like a Tutsi. I walked through all the buildings. There were corpses everywhere, in every building, everywhere you looked. Also here, in the inner courtyard. The place was full of corpses, 35,000 of them. The ground was littered with dead people.
For 100 days between April and July 1994, Rwanda was ravaged by one of the most intensive campaigns of mass murder in history. Radical Hutus killed an estimated 1 million people, Tutsis and moderate Hutus, with the backing of a significant section of the population.
I walked through all the buildings. There were bodies everywhere, in every single building. Here in the courtyard as well. There were bodies everywhere you looked. 35,000 dead people. The ground was littered with bodies.
ubundi barahageze igitero kije batangiye kwica bamwe nyine bakamamagira birukanka bavamo rero amamagira yiruka
ese abavuyemo barabishe barabafashe bakabica nangwa benshi babiciraga ku mazi abarokotse ni bakeya ni bake cyane
twarokokeye turi benshi twaba turi nka
bane mubara hangaho murashe aha hembukiye asanga umwana we yapfuye
kuko nanjye bagiye bazi ko napfuye kuko kandi koko nari napfuye
bari bakoresha uyu bari umutima gushya wakanguse wavuye hangaho intore rimwe zari zahagiye
urabona hano bahateye amasaha agiye umunsi bateraga byari mu masaha ya 9:00 ubwo abantu ntago babishe ngo babarangize bumva bwari bwije hari abahateye bari benshi ariko n'abahungiye natwe twari benshi baraje baratwica uwo munsi saa 11 yarageraga bagataha.
On the first day the Interahamwe arrived, a lot of residents, Hutus and Tutsis, were gathered on the market square. They initially assumed the intruders were ordinary bandits and tried to defend themselves. But they didn't stand a chance. The villagers, Hutus and Tutsis alike, were forced to strip and lie on the ground in the sun. It was 11 a.m. on April 15th, 1994. And at 11 a.m. in Rwanda, the sun beats down mercilessly. At 3 p.m., the Interahamwe ordered the Hutus to get up and then handed them spears, machetes, and clubs. Their Tutsi neighbors were not to get up, ever. Panic broke out around and outside the village. Most of the Tutsis fled into the church, believing they would be safe there. But this would not be the case. A precious few managed to escape. This man was one of them. With a spear having pierced his chest, he fled on foot 25 kilometers to neighboring Tanzania.
It was the worst genocide ever seen. All genocides are cruel, but imagine, In Rwanda, there were even people who paid to be killed with a gunshot. The methods used by the murderers were appalling. They'd cut off people's arms and heads and just leave the bodies there. They killed children by throwing them against walls. They did atrocious things. We counted 56 different methods of killing.
As the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or INKOTANYI, continued to advance, Denis Polizi tried to organize a semblance of administration.
The first thing that hit me when I arrived was the stench. It was awful. Then I went inside the buildings. The walls were covered in blood. It was really distressing.
"50,000 Tutsis were slaughtered in Nyamata. The two massacres in Nyarubuye and then Nyamata would together account for an eighth of the total death toll from the initial genocidal rampage. By the start of May, 2/3 of that total were already dead.
As I walked through the streets of Nyamata, someone told me that there were still children in the village who nobody was taking care of. All the buildings here were empty. I asked that they be taken to the school, and there I sang songs with them.
The RPF INKOTANYI advanced, pushing back the government troops. Meanwhile, the Interahamwe continued their spree of death and destruction, killing any Tutsis who had survived or escaped the initial carnage. Kagame's soldiers roamed the villages over the dead bodies of Tutsis and killing any moderate Hutus who crossed their path. The battle for Kigali on May 21st was devastating for both the INKOTANYI and the government troops. Paul Kagame decided to have his troops advance gradually in stages. He wanted to minimize casualties among his men, who he would need to rebuild the country after the war, rather than sacrifice them in one of the final battles of a conflict where the outcome was already clear. The INKOTANYI took one town after another. In early June 1994, they overthrew the government, which then fled to Gisenyi, in the west of the country, close to the border with Zaire. France had to acknowledge that its side in the conflict was losing. On June 18, 1994, President François Mitterrand issued orders to launch Opération Turquoise as a humanitarian measure. Time is running out, he explained, at a point in time where 75% of the Tutsis were already dead. What were France's true intentions in Rwanda, where the INKOTANYI were on the verge of taking control?
The French intention was to deny the RPF the legitimacy to some places they can. If it had been possible, they would have denied the legitimacy for the whole country.
Nous avions des affirmations belliqueuses de la part de l'UFPR.
The RPF and INKOTANYI were making threatening statements, saying they would push the French back out of the country. It was very unsettling. After the French had been assigned the UN mandate, they immediately established contact with Kagame via political channels. Right at the beginning of the operation, he was informed that France did not intend to reconquer Rwanda or oppose him or the RPF. Some of the French soldiers had served in Rwanda a number of years earlier, and now they were back in the same country, except this time they had to assume a very different stance. They had to be impartial.
Impartial in the face of an ongoing genocide? France's neutrality was repeatedly called into question by the INKOTANYI, external observers, and later even by some French officers.
The captain told me, "We have orders to stop the RPF via an ambush in the woods of Nyungwe." At 6 a.m., when the helicopters were just taking off, a commanding officer came over, crossed his arms, and shouted, "Stop!" The helicopters that were already taking off had to land again. We were really annoyed because we'd prepared for the mission. And of course, everyone was feeling tense. I jumped off the helicopter, went up to the officer, and asked him what was going on. I wanted to know who the orders had come from. He explained to me calmly, it was 6 a.m. on July 1st, that the operation had been aborted. They'd reached an agreement with the RPF, and France would be setting up a safe humanitarian zone.
In Paris, opinion was very much divided, not only among the military chiefs of staff, but also at the political level. The Council of Senior Cabinet Ministers was split into two camps. One, headed by the president's spokesman, Hubert Védrine, and Foreign Minister Alain Juppé, and supported by hardliners from the army, wanted to stop Paul Kagame. The other camp, including Prime Minister Edouard Balladur and Defense Minister François Léotard, were more hesitant, preferring a purely humanitarian operation.
Some of the elements of the military wanted war, and there were some within the Chirac camp who backed them because of the damage they knew it would cause Prime Minister Balladur.
Edouard Balladur ended up secretly dispatching two emissaries to Rwanda to talk to Paul Kagame, writer Jean-Christophe Ruffin and historian Gérard Prunier.
We were sent to reason with Kagame. We said, "There are a couple of madmen in France who would like to fight against you. And your side also had a few madmen who would be willing to fight the French. So let's be reasonable and avoid that."
That same meeting also saw the drawing up of the safe humanitarian zone. Tensions between Paris and Kagame were calmed, at least temporarily. Nevertheless, the INKOTANYI refused to accept France preventing them from winning the war. They eventually resorted to action that has remained largely hidden from the public. In mid-July, a few days before that final victory, the INKOTANYI captured 23 French troops attempting to cross their lines.
The French troops were captured. They were surrounded, and we used it almost to bargain. And it was like, look, this is our country, and we're going to enter this territory whether you want it or not. So if you agree that we will go there anyway because this is our country and this is our territory, I have no problem letting these people go. And it's not that we want their blood, it's like we want our rights in the place. So there was that, and it actually led to later on resolving the problem.
Mistakes and follies always come with a high price, and France was guilty of a whole range of follies, motivated by a desire for French dominance in Africa. From the point of view of France, that position was threatened by Anglo-Saxon imperialism. They claimed the RPF were being backed by elements in British-dominated Uganda. But the British didn't give a damn about the RPF.
After taking Kigali on July 4th, 2 weeks later, the INKOTANYI had gained control of the entire country, with just over 12,000 soldiers. Paul Kagame, at the time 36, now had the responsibility of dealing with the consequences of an unprecedented wave of slaughter and destruction. The shocking toll after 100 days, up to 1 million Tutsis murdered and 250,000 women raped, while 2 million moderate Hutus were forcibly relocated to the border with Zaire to be exploited as human shields for the extremists.
There was death smelling everywhere. It was just death. Everything was more or less dead. Even those who were still alive, we could see on their faces it was difficult to put up with. It was difficult to know even where to start from. We have to start from somewhere and start rebuilding this country. We couldn't allow ourselves and our country to just get lost and perish.
Rwanda was desolated. There was no gasoline, no electricity, no banknotes. The Tutsis who had escaped the genocide gradually started to return from exile to their country, a country they would no longer recognize, a country still littered with human corpses. The survivors found homes in the now abandoned and destroyed buildings. The new government of national unity tried to exhibit the trappings of normality. Paul Kagame was named defense minister and vice president. Pasteur Bizimungu, a moderate Hutu who had aligned himself with the RPF, was appointed president. But the real power, as everyone knew, lay in the hands of the victorious military chief, Paul Kagame.
The RPA had a lot of responsibility. We had taken over the country. There was no police, no gendarmerie, nothing. There were no institutions, even the local administration, nothing. So the RPA was in charge of almost everything. Some in Herahamwe, in the remote areas of the country, were still killing people. So the RPA was also responsible to stop that. So it's like the RPA was a bit stressed and overworked.
The INKOTANYI struggled to impose discipline, starting within their own ranks. RPF officers were committing atrocities against civilians, while armed soldiers avenged their families. A number of officers appeared to lose all restraint amidst the deadly chaos. Paul Kagame tried to put a stop to the cycle of retaliation, having several hundred of his own men imprisoned and some executed as a deterrent. Kagame was now deploying a dubious and double-edged political instrument, a reign of terror. One question remains to this day: whether he had a choice.
It's a very complicated area. You see, there is nothing that is going to be absolute here. And I knew, and everybody knew, even with such a strong sense of discipline, some things were going to happen, and they happened. We are human beings. There are always going to be limitations with all of us.
On April 22, 1995, Interahamwe forces who had infiltrated the last existing displaced persons camp on Rwandan territory attacked INKOTANYI soldiers, right under the eyes of UN troops. The INKOTANYI response was swift and devastating. 4,000 people in the camp were killed, many of them trampled to death in the resulting mass panic.
There was repeated pressure from the government in Kigali to dissolve the camp and have the people return to their homes and villages. And the result was this terrible massacre. I think this was a combination of two factors: spontaneous outbreaks of violence, which are comprehensible in this kind of situation, and a strategy of terror. After such an orgy of violence, there will inevitably be people settling scores, such as soldiers taking personal revenge for their murdered families.
I traveled with President Kagame through various European countries to make our message clear. People were still being killed in Rwanda, and the perpetrators were able to return unhindered to Congo. And what was Europe doing? Nothing. Just the same old hot air and unrealistic promises.
They did nothing, and I knew they would do nothing. I was telling them, look, you have camps across in Congo. You have weapons. Where on earth do you tell me refugee camps are like this? When you take humanitarian assistance to these camps, you are benefiting these militias and the armed groups that has just relocated across the border.
In those 2 years, we were begging Mobutu, please, either disarm these people and also remove them from the border. No, he would do nothing. So, when Kabila came to see me, I said, Kabila, I don't have a problem with Mobutu myself. So there's no way I can help you. But I know somebody who has got a problem with Mobutu. And this is Vice President Kagame.
Laurent Désiré Kabila would become a vital ally of Paul Kagame as head of the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, or ADFL. Kagame himself took a back seat, leaving the fighting to his right-hand man, Lieutenant Colonel James Kabarebe.
My first meeting with Laurent Désiré Kabila was just here, in this military camp. He impressed me on how he had fought wars against Mobutu in the 60s, together with Che Guevara. I had heard and read about Che Guevara, therefore I saw this is the right man.
Yoweri Museveni, the Ugandan president, provided Paul Kagame with diplomatic support and arms. He had the U.S. on his side, while the French backed the leader and dictator of Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko. It was the beginning of the First Congo War, starting with the dismantling of the Hutu refugee camps.
When the INKOTANYI attacked, they left a corridor open in the town of Goma, providing access to the Rwandan border. The INKOTANYI opened the border, enabling those refugees who had the opportunity to enter. Some of the soldiers also returned to Rwanda, but the majority of them withdrew into the interior of the Congo.
The refugee camps were shut down. After 2 years in exile, almost 90% of the displaced Hutus in Congo, then still Zaire, returned to Rwanda.
No country tolerates being attacked from its own borders. Every leader would probably have reacted the way Kagame did. There was a real and genuine threat. The closure of the refugee camps was followed by the large waves of returning refugees moving westward, beginning in late 1996. There were retaliatory attacks and acts of revenge, and a new series of massacres. Médecins Sans Frontières, the Red Cross, and the UNHCR had teams stationed on the ground. They took in refugees who came to them and saw to their needs. But they also had to dig mass graves for the dead.
While this new humanitarian disaster continued to unfold, the troops under the command of Laurent Désiré Kabila and James Kabarebe continued their advance into Zaire. Just 6 months later, they had arrived at the capital, Kinshasa. The génocidaires, those who had perpetrated the mass murder in Rwanda, were being pushed back or killed, in some cases using civilians as human shields.
Les troupes de Laurent Kabila ont atteint leur objectif. Ils occupent la capitale du Zaïre. La dernière page du moboutisme se tourne. Kinshasa est tombée.
Ces troupes de l'Alliance qui sont rentrées de façon tout à fait pacifique, comme vous pouvez le voir sur ces images, dans le centre même de la ville. Vous remarquez que si les gens sont exubérants, les troupes de l'Alliance restent bien disciplinées. Ils ont le visage fermé. Vous êtes content d'être arrivé?
I speak not.
What do you speak?
Not.
The capture of Kinshasa by Lieutenant Colonel James Kabarebe marked the end of Mobutu's 30-year dictatorship. The new president would, as had been agreed, be Laurent Désiré Kabila. But a new disaster was soon to strike. Zaire, now renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo, lay in ruins, but was still full of material temptations. In less than a year, renewed tensions saw the political situation deteriorate. Kabila accused the INKOTANYI of enriching themselves from the country's resources and made ominous threats toward the Tutsis living in the DRC. James Kabarebe returned to Rwanda, where the final battles were being fought in early 1998. In the Lake Kivu region between Rwanda and the DRC, former génocidaires and armed Hutu groups conducted renewed attacks on the Tutsis now living there. They were led by General Paul Rwaakabije.
Some Rwandan soldiers who had supported Kabila returned to their country to fight us from there. That's why we began secretly sending our soldiers into Rwanda, about 50 a week. They left at night and reached Rwanda while it was still dark. As they grew in number, the new government noticed them, and the fighting intensified.
Ces groupes persistent. Leurs intentions n'ont pas changé. Ils sont armés et veulent utiliser leurs armes. Nous sommes déterminés à les combattre. Notre rôle est de débarrasser le pays de ces groupes qui ont probablement commis le génocide et qui continuent à faire la même chose.
There were some men who wanted us to stand our ground and keep on fighting in Rwanda, while others said, "We've already lost so many people, let's go back to Congo and reorganize." I, as commander, opted for the second solution.
General Rwaakabije withdrew his men from Rwanda to eastern Congo, where he regrouped his rebel forces. Soon there was a new wave of massacres. Laurent Désiré Kabila supported the rebels in their fight against Paul Kagame. The Second Congo War ensued, which would involve 7 countries. More than 20 years later, the violence had not ended, as dozens of proxy militias fought over priceless mineral reserves. And the UN force looked on, powerless to intervene. Genocide destroys all hope. No good can come of it. A never-ending cycle of violence and retaliation and terror. One that here could only be broken by attempts at forgiveness, in a historic reconciliation process made possible by the humanity and commitment of countless individuals.
I don't think we find a solution in a death sentence. We lost so many people, over 1 million people. I don't think killing those who killed to such an extent is going to provide us with a solution. Because you really kill until you get tired, even legally. You sentence them to death, which you know you won't implement anyway. So why do you have it?
Every Rwandan had a connection to the genocide, on both sides. Hutus who did not actively participate in the genocide, but who had a cousin or other family members involved in the killing. The same applied to the Tutsis. Even those who were not victims of the genocide themselves had lost someone from their family. The genocide affected everyone, every Rwandan.
Tito Rutemamara was instrumental in the creation of the Gacaca courts based on local conflict resolution traditions. Almost 2 million cases were tried in total, half of them resulting in convictions. The judges were taken from the population. The fundamental principle, no impunity, but also no revenge. Those individuals who had killed others but were judged to be henchmen rather than commanders were handed jail sentences of around 7 years.
It's the real sense of justice, because in a genocide, there are those who were the masterminds, who planned it, who made sure they brought others into it, and so on and so forth. There are another level of people who are just driven into doing it, and they went ahead and they did it. But even for the lower cases, there is some sense of accountability, but equal to their level of responsibility. Yes.
Yaragowe kubona ese icyo gihe nabura nsoreze nawe icyo gihe ko wari umubonye ari inshuti yawe iyo umushyira ahantu noneho ejo akazarenza umunsi ubwo amagambo nayo mbega nta n'ikindi nongera kuvuga.
I can understand the victim saying, you people, you are not doing enough for me. Even in terms of justice alone, you haven't done enough. How can somebody kill my family and I'm seeing them alive there? I really sympathize with that. I understand it fully. What we are doing also involves the future of all of us, because we must have a future.
The Gacaca trials also proved controversial and could never resolve everything. But they did help families come to terms with the genocide, even if many survivors were unable to forgive, while the perpetrators did not expect to be pardoned. Meanwhile, the INKOTANYI integrated former fighters from the old government forces that had served the previous Rwandan leader, Juvenal Habyarimana, into the new national army. In 2003, Hutu rebel leader General Paul Ruakabije capitulated, a decisive turning point.
Myself and General Kabarebe, who was chief of staff of the INKOTANYI forces, had a lengthy meeting. He said, when we fight against each other, it means Rwandans dying on both sides. What's the point? He explained his perspective, while I asked him a range of questions. He explained everything to me in detail.
Many of those who had planned and coordinated the genocide, however, would end up being made accountable for their actions. Some, such as Colonel Theoneste Bagasora and former Rwandan Prime Minister Jean Kambanda, were tracked down abroad and put on trial. The extremist Hutu ideologues comprised a minority. In November 1994, the UN established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha, Tanzania. 86 defendants were charged with organizing the genocide. 70 were convicted, most of them receiving life sentences.
Monsieur Jean Kambanda, plaidez-vous coupable ou non coupable? Je plaide coupable.
In France, which now stood accused of having assisted the génocidaire, investigative judge Jean-Louis Bruguière was pursuing a case against the government of Paul Kagame in connection with Habyarimana's death.
Jean-Louis Bruguière had made a name for himself as a terrorist hunter. He has always worked for French state interests. He developed a hypothesis and did all he could to substantiate it. He published a report that made for some pretty astonishing reading. I've read that report, and I have to say it's, how should I put it, worthy of a mediocre ninth grader. There's nothing in it. Bruguière incriminated several Rwandan leaders, provoking a crisis between France and Rwanda, which was convenient for a number of people.
The genocidal killers had received military support from the French government. So this was a way of distracting attention. It means that two major democratic nations in Europe instrumentalized their own justice systems, ridiculed them, in fact, as if they were banana republics. So, in order to acquit themselves, they made the victims of the genocide responsible for their own extermination. It's tragic, unbelievable.
In 2006, arrest warrants were issued for 9 individuals close to Paul Kagame, including James Kabarebe. Rwanda subsequently broke off diplomatic relations with France. The crisis was now at its height. In 2009, Bruguière was succeeded by Marc Trévidic, who questioned a substantial part of his predecessor's report. Only now did Rwanda resume diplomatic relations with France.
Sourire et protocole élyséen, Paul Kagame, président du Rwanda, refuse avec obstination de s'attarder sur la tumultueuse histoire franco-rwandaise. La visite est dénoncée ou boudée par d'anciens responsables de l'armée et de nombreux hommes politiques.
L'entreprise de falsification de l'histoire, qui est régulièrement développée par le régime de Kigali, est à la fois mensongère et insultante pour la France. C'est la raison pour laquelle je me suis exprimé à ce sujet. Je ne vais pas revenir sur le fond.
We'll get there. We don't bear grudges. It's nothing. We won. And we're not angry with anyone. Who should we be resentful towards? Who? This is a series of events, a system of domination that creates these things. We Rwandans also bear responsibility, of course. We're primarily responsible for everything, all of us.
Nyarabuye, 22 years after the massacre. The remains of the victims are brought from a mass grave to the memorial site. The last visible traces of the genocide carried out a generation ago. The more time that passes, the less people forget about the genocide. The silence of the hills recalls the deafening silence of the dead. Trying to define contemporary Rwanda is a challenge. Many paradoxes and contradictions remain. Since being sworn in as president in 2000, Paul Kagame has been re-elected 3 times with a significant majority. His overwhelming victories at the polls raised questions, while his manner of conducting state affairs fell considerably short of Western standards. But he's enjoyed genuine popularity as a guarantor of security and stability now so desperately needed. In December 2015, the Rwandan electorate voted on a referendum to remove limits on the potential tenure of the president. The international community expressed its concern over this new development.
Mr. President, my name is Kenneth Agutamba. I write for the New Times. It's an honor to be here. To the Rwandans who voted overwhelmingly to remove constitutional term limits, what's your message to them? And to the critics abroad, what's your answer to them? Thank you very much.
Like I was reading, I think, was it Time magazine or something, and had written that the majority of Rwandans have chosen a dictatorship. I think that is giving dictatorship a good name. Probably they are making that mistake without knowing that they are making a mistake. because if a dictatorship means, one, the choice of people, two, if a dictatorship produces some of the things we had earlier that I repeated, it's about security, safety, stability, it's about women empowerment, it's about people living together where the past has been terrible and different. It's about progress being made. People can feed themselves, they have food security.
At home and abroad, Paul Kagame presents his vision of Africa's future, renewing the idea of Pan-Africanism, the hope for cooperation and unity among all states on the continent and their independence in cultural, political, and energy issues. As manifested every last Saturday of the month in Rwanda, when everyone takes part in compulsory community work. Cooperation instead of conflict.
If you look at the global affairs, Africa has continued to get a raw deal in everything, politically, socially, economically, and so on. And the question is why? For me, Pan-Africanism should even be built on not accepting, rejecting this sense of superiority that has been created globally, that some people are superior to others, and Africa is always at the bottom of that ranking. So Pan-Africanism, for me, carries a lot of meaning in that sense, that we are a unique and unified entity. In the world as it is, with Pan-Africanism, Africa is better off because of how it has been mistreated and mismanaged, both from outside and even from within. So from within, these are the issues we have to resolve ourselves, and then be able to confront from this mismanagement from without.
We are not the INKOTANYI soldiers who risked their lives as 20-year-olds in 1990. We are not the Rwandan leader, guarantor of a national unity that was utterly shattered here in Rwanda. All Western filmmakers can do is uncover and observe the particular circumstances that define Rwanda, the contradictions and the common ground. Resilience does not mean resolution and healing, but it is a process on the path to healing. And in today's Rwanda, it can only be hoped that its people will be able to find that strength to banish the demons of the past once and for all.